What's up? Welcome back to Nowstalgia. Dave here with a review of The Housemaid, the new erotic thriller film starring Sydney Sweeney, Amanda Seyfried, and Brandon Sklenar. This is the latest film from Paul Feig, who has been on a bit of a cold streak overall. Obviously he's made some of the great comedies such as Bridesmaids, but Another Simple Favor last year, or actually was that earlier this year, I found particularly poor. He's also had some Netflix schlock lately. Hasn't been his best run, but this film comes out as kind of counter-programming against Avatar this holiday season from Lionsgate, based on the 2022 novel from Frida McFadden. This is Sydney Sweeney's second high-profile movie in just a few months. Of course, she just recently portrayed Christy in the boxing biopic film. Housemaid is more of Sweeney in her more familiar mold, not playing an athlete and kind of uglying herself up. She's back to her normal ways, I guess you could say, with this film. The Housemaid is an entertaining yet frustrating erotic thriller film. The concept of Sydney Sweeney playing a live-in maid for a very wealthy family and quickly finding herself coming between the husband and the wife. That's a premise that makes a lot of sense and seems like a decent fit for Sydney Sweeney. My biggest problem with this film is that I didn't love the execution. You need to get about halfway through the movie to get to that first twist where we get to Amanda Seyfried's character's perspective on things, where the movie takes its level up. Unfortunately, I just found a lot of it pretty frustrating because the beginning is so grating and then the twists lead themselves to such a 180 that it's ultimately like a really big tonal shift. I think the erotic thriller angle of it actually works pretty well, but we go so far away from that so quickly. The movie kind of just gives you whiplash as we really jump across. A strange movie, but it's certainly pulpy enough to serve as effective counter-programming this holiday season. I would not be surprised if it becomes a modest hit. We quickly establish where we are with this story early on. Sydney Sweeney plays Millie, someone who's down on her luck and needs this live-in housemaid job. We learn to actually maintain her parole out of prison, and we learn why she's out on parole, what crime she committed later on in the movie. But she has this pretty sweet gig where she gets to save on rent and live within the home of this very wealthy family living on Long Island, the Winchesters. Andrew, Brandon Sklenar, who's just a kind of boring businessman, but kind of the perfect husband and the perfect dad. Obviously incredibly handsome man and seemingly very caring and outgoing and thoughtful. And his wife Nina, played by Amanda Seyfried, is a lot more cold and coarse with Millie, but Millie figures she might as well just put up with this because the situation's still pretty good for her. I think the thing that really I kind of brushed up against is it's just such a tough sit in early on because Nina is just so cruel and mean and calculating with Millie, and it's kind of hard to watch, honestly, because it's just so one-sided. And Sydney Sweeney's not exactly super reactive in this first part of the movie. She's keeping it pretty slight, she's keeping it pretty baseline. It's not like she's getting super emotional like Cassie on Euphoria. It's not that type of character. So the movie felt a little inert to me in the beginning. Once we finally get to the twist in the beginning of the movie, that's where things really shake up. And of course, leading to that twist, of course, the will there or won't they sexual tension between Brandon Sklenar and Sydney Sweeney does in fact take place. Pretty contrived setting overall, but I think it comes across as decently romantic the way all that kind of develops, and you get a honestly pretty robust sex scene for Hollywood in 2025. I was actually quite surprised with how much was shown and how that was filmed. I think it was filmed quite well, and it's tasteful but still actually shows some nudity, which is frankly just not what you see anymore. Erotic thriller as a concept is effectively dead as a film genre that gets made anymore. So the fact that they actually did a true erotic thriller sex scene, I was actually kind of impressed with. Now it's the only one you get. There's only one in the movie, but again, it comes across as unusual nowadays. So once Andrew decides to replace his pretty mean and unstable wife with Millie, the movie completely flips. And when I saw that happen, I looked and I was like, oh wow, the movie's only halfway through. What more is going to happen? And I hadn't watched the trailer, so I didn't actually know if a lot of these twists were previously telegraphed. Maybe some people knew that was all coming. I didn't know at all. I was just going in super blind. But once we switch to Amanda Seyfried's perspective, we learn about Nina's backstory, and we learn about what she was going through and how she was actually happy to finally escape uh, the grasp of her husband that to this point we've only seen as this very kind and thoughtful person. It's like, oh wow, there's a lot here. And in the beginning of the movie and kind of throughout that first part, Sydney Sweeney is doing some narration, some voiceover, and then we switch and we get Amanda Seyfried doing it for her own character. And it's a bit exposition-y for sure. I guess kind of similar to A Simple Favor from Paul Feig as well. It's not the most elegant way to tell the story, but once you get that next twist too, when we realize that Andrew is actually just this crazy controlling psychopath, and he targets the women he's with to control them and keep them within his grasp. And next thing you know, we're locked in a room, and he does these super ridiculous punishments when people make really minor mistakes in his presence because he's such a perfectionist. And it's like the movie's just completely flipped at that point. And I think that stuff's like kind of amusing, right? It never really lends itself into like true horror tropes, I would say, but there's obviously the scariness of this big hulking man kind of trying to dominate the situation. But yeah, like I think from there it's just like it was still never like the energy never quite got high enough for me, you know. Frankly, like in terms of Sydney Sweeney movies, I like Christie a lot more than this. Like in terms of the two Sydney Sweeney movies this year, I actually like Christie a lot more than The Housemaid. I thought The Housemaid just kind of dragged by the end. I thought it was a bit too long, and was kind of whatever to me overall. Versus Christie, super conventional sports biopic film, but I think the storytelling was just a lot more clear and stable the entire time. And even if it's not the most ambitious film, it still kind of gets its point across, I think, in a decent way. And I think Sweeney's performance is a lot more interesting in Christie versus in The Housemaid. I think she's just kind of doing it pretty straight, honestly, you know. I think of her recent work, whether it's Christie, whether it was Reality, right? Obviously, of course, Euphoria. Those are the roles that kind of jump out to me as the best stuff from Sydney Sweeney. And The Housemaid, it's not like it's Anyone But You, where she's actually just kind of being charming and just being her natural self, and the genre is really benefiting from her just doing that. The Housemaid could have used, I think, another side of Sweeney's performance, and she doesn't quite get into the playfulness of her character at the very end of the film when the tide turns and she has some power for the first time. I would have liked a little bit more. So yeah, I think it's ultimately it's a product of the novel, right? This is pretty schlocky. This is not far out of the realm of like a Colleen Hoover adaptation movie, right? So it's hard to ever go into something like this with high expectations, but I found it pretty middling overall. I'm just most interested in how successful it'll end up being in the holiday season as the second biggest release after Avatar, Fire and Ash, of course, right? And so, of course, there's holdovers like Zootopia 2 and Wicked, but I think this has a chance to actually do pretty decently to end the year here at the box office, which would be a nice thing because, erotic thrillers as a genre basically are non-existent. Can't ask for too much, but we'll see. Let me know, though, what'd you think of The Housemaid? Did you like it more than me? Let me know. And for more movie reviews, subscribe. I'll see you next time.